Morning, Neil Sean here in the very heart of London, and as ever we want to share with you what happened on this day. Well, one of the biggest stars of, well, really any era. We sadly lost him on this day way back in 1926. It's interesting, isn't it, because this was previously from a world of anything really. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. This was because this particular person was one of the very true first icons of the cinema. The late and brilliant Rudolph Valentino. Now, I don't know about you, but I've often wondered with Rudolph Valentino whether he could have ever really taken off into the silence, because when you think about it, he was known as the great lover, wasn't he? Always playing those sheiks and, you know, swatting around with capes and lots of eyeliner, looking directly into camera, you know, the usual thing. What's interesting also is that he really did amazingly get so many millions of people flocking to the cinema. Studio bosses loved him because he truly could make them thousands and thousands of pounds in a week. He was known as really the very first male matinee idol. Of course, there were many others in that era in the female form, as we mentioned before. People like Clara Bow, Louise Brooks, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., but there truly were none bigger than Rudolph Valentino. Now, in this generation, I would say he's slightly more forgotten, but when you look back in these sort of, history books of film, he's always there simply because he truly was the very first. And sadly, on this day, we lost him. It was a very sort of unexpected and short illness. But amazingly, and this is true, women would be throwing themselves off the top of buildings, onto railway lines, all that sort of stuff. They were completely devastated at the loss of the world's very first movie idol. But what else happened on this day? It's one of the world's most famous pieces of music ever. Everybody knows this classical piece, even if you don't know the composer. But we're talking Tchaikovsky, and in 1882, on this day, the very first performance of Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture debuted in Moscow in Russia. Was it an instant success? You bet. But it's interesting, as I often say, because obviously the only way you could have reheard this was to keep going back to the concerts and the concert halls and the opera houses, because there were no phonographs, there was no way of playing it again unless an orchestra knew it, or you could buy very expensive early versions of sheet music. Not bad though, eh? Way back in 1920, can you imagine life without the radio? Well, you just have me, wouldn't you? But way back in 1920, the very first commercial radio station, 8MK, Detroit News Radio Phone, which is now called WWJ, began operations in Detroit, Michigan. And this was really radical when you think, because it was the very first time that commercial radio taken off around the world. And by that, that featured sort of ads and all the things that we know of today, sponsorship deals, proving, as I often say here on the show, simply nothing is new. Now, a man born on this day, 1943, is none other than one of my favourite all-time sci-fi stars, Sylvester McCoy. Now, famous over here, starring in the sci-fi cult show Doctor Who. Now, he was in the original versions, as they call it, alongside another brilliant friend of mine, Bonnie Langford. She played his assistant. This was before Doctor Who had some money spent on it. Now, we go into sort of two divides here if you're a Doctor Who fan. If you're like me, you like it a little bit more plainer and more homegrown, then you will like the era of Sylvester McCoy, Peter Davison, John Pertwee, people like that. Of course, the minute they revamped it, then that's a whole new generation and a whole new different sort of, fan base. But Sylvester McCoy still goes around on the fan bases today, is incredibly popular, and the resales of that series that he starred in are one of the highest in the Doctor Who series. Now it's time for a little bit of culture here on the show, because way back in 1862, on this day, the French composer Debussy was born. And he was basically, again, a huge force in the classical music world. It's hard to explain, isn't it? Because, they are the sort of pop stars of their day. And they were not only just brilliant composers, but great larger-than-life characters too, that were able to sell out and fill really massive concert halls night after night, because people wanted to hear and of course experience their very first hits. For those of you that like your film noirs, this will really interest you, because on this day, principal photography started on a cult film, a true cult film of the 1940s era. That's right, The Postman Always Rings Twice, which starred John Garfield and the brilliant and beautiful Lana Turner. Now this was a real departure for Lana Turner because she'd really only played sort of good time girls, things like that before. And this was, she was seen as a bad girl, you know, terribly sort of racy for the period, let me tell you. I tell you, the MGM boss Louis B. Mayer didn't want to put the movie out through MGM. He didn't feel that it fitted in with the MGM sort of ethos of family viewing, way too naughty. And by the way, if you're looking at this picture and you're remembering that Lana Turner was dressed all in white, then you're right. That was her idea. She wanted to look standout, remembering, beautiful, and in every scene she really did captivate. Now apparently Lana had the hots for John Garfield, but sadly John didn't have the hots for her, and she apparently felt that if he had it might have been even more explosive on the screen. It's been voted one of the best all-time film noirs ever, and principal photography started on this epic, on this day, all those years ago. Now if you want to see a brilliant afternoon film and enjoy some spectacular acting without all the special effects but just showing true talent, why not rent or simply look online for some clips for free of The Postman Always Rings Twice. You're up to date with all the news that happened on this day in history. Now, will I see you tomorrow? Neil Sean in the very heart of London.